Hey everyone, Tito here, and I'm sure a ton of you have a lot of questions. Why am I starting a second channel when I have my main Macho Nacho Productions channel? The main two reasons why I decided to start this second channel. First is to showcase some of these smaller mods and other products that I wouldn't normally post on my main channel. Another reason is to give my Patreon supporters early access to these videos, have this opportunity to interact with the actual Patreon supporters themselves by giving them the opportunity to ask me questions. Plan is to address these questions at the end of each of these videos. And in this first video, what I decided to look at is the Chromatic from Mod Retro. And I actually bought this when it was available. You know, I was kind of intrigued when it was first announced. And I've actually just been sitting on this since I think I received it a few months ago. This is a first edition set. The first thing that sort of struck me when I saw this is it kind of gave me the old school Tamagotchi vibes. I don't know if you remember the packaging of those, but they kind of had like little doodles, sort of like this. You know, here we have a list of features. So first one, enjoy your library of newly created games. So I guess they're gonna be making games dedicated to this console. Maybe, you know, Mod Retro will be making their own games. You can also play your classics, obviously. So I have a bunch of different Game Boy, original Game Boy and Game Boy Color cards we're gonna be testing out. This sort of pixel level accuracy display. So, and it's sunlight readable. And sort of here we have premium features. So you have a sapphire crystal display cover, which is interesting. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then this magnesium alloy shell. It's also powered by, that's interesting. So usually products like this come with like an internal rechargeable lithium-ion battery, but this one actually requires AA batteries, but it does say rechargeable or rechargeable pack. So anyway, actually, you know, this could be a good thing, you know, or a bad thing depending on what your preferences are, but I sort of like having this AA battery option. Anyway, let's go ahead and tear this thing open. For those of you who may not know, the guy who started Mod Retro, I believe started the Oculus company, which eventually Facebook bought. Oh, I like this. Pretty nice packaging. So you got some nice artwork here, Math Quiz Friday. So yeah, they're definitely going for this like middle school, high school doodle theme here, which I do kind of like actually. It's sort of different from what we've seen, which is generally more of a, you know, I have this analog case here. It's more of a very minimalist Apple type look. So I actually kind of like this. And I actually went with this pink colored console. I think there was like 3 or 4. And this one just kind of reminded me of Kirby. Like this is kind of a Kirby theme. And underneath, ooh, we got the Tetris game itself. You know, it's its own custom cart. Actually, it's funny. This actually looks used. You can see the scratch marks. It looks like this has already been inserted and removed a couple times. All right, so that's kind of the contents. There's nothing really else in here. Okay, so it's interesting. It has a little latch here that you can lift up. So it looks like there's some contacts here. This might be for that lithium, that rechargeable pack that they're talking about. So that might be for that in the future. But let's go ahead and put the Tetris in there. Let's go ahead and power that on. Oh wow, that's very loud. Oh, this is nice. Wow, so this potentiometer for the volume actually feels, it's really smooth. Kind of like that. So we got the game there, you got your link port. You have a little loop here for, you know, a little wrist strap or something. You got it on both sides actually. And this is, I guess, a menu button. So we push that. If we go over to display, so okay, we got a frame blending feature. Actually, this isn't unique to the Mod Retro. A lot of these consoles, including the Analog Pocket, have a frame blending feature. And this is basically to mimic the refresh rate of the original displays on the Game Boys, which basically the game developers use to their advantage to sort of make certain objects look transparent. But when you put a modern display mod on you know, these Game Boy consoles, they would flicker because obviously the refresh rates on the new screens are much higher. So the firmware that I am currently running is 0.11.2, and I guess the FPGA firmware is version 16.0. Wow, okay, so it's a fairly I guess mature firmware. That's interesting. And then player, oh, okay, so player, I guess if you use the link port, you can kind of set to what player you want to be. You know, the display actually, it looks really nice. Now, we're gonna get into the display itself a little bit later, but basically this is a custom-made display specific to the Mod Retro as far as I know. And essentially it has the same aspect ratio as the original Game Boy, which I believe is 160 by 144. This is the actual resolution for that. So this isn't kind of using sort of like the Analog Pocket, which has a very high resolution screen and sort of mimics these sort of large pixels. This is actually a 160 by 144 resolution screen, so custom made for this, which also, of course, limits it to basically only playing, Game Boy Color games, because since you don't have more pixels, a higher resolution, you really can't play other game consoles on this. This is compatible with original Game Boy and Game Boy Color carts, so let's test that out. Here I got Pokemon Red, turn that on, and we can see it boots up just fine. Sound is very good. Yeah, so this works really well. It loads my game perfectly. Let's try a Game Boy Color game. So for that, I have Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. Boots right up. Controls look good. The display is actually quite nice. You can really see the individual pixels. And yeah, no, this is really nice. So another thing I wanted to try are Japanese games, because as you may or may not know, the Game Boy is not region locked. So this should work with Japanese Game Boy Color. So here I have Zelda Link's Awakening, boots right up. Wario Land, again for the original Game Boy, not Game Boy Color, but also boots up perfectly. Another thing that I wanted to try out is regular flash cards. So here I have an older EverDrive from Crix, and hey, that works as well. So let's see what this looks inside. All right, so that comes out pretty easily. You have like the original, usually there's like an RF shield, so this also has it. Got the Mod Retro branding down here. Yeah, and you can kind of see that, the paint didn't make it in all the corners. That doesn't really matter on the inside, but it did, unfortunately, you can kind of see it here that they kind of missed the corners there, and it is visible from the outside. All right, so if we look in here, we can kind of see that it has one of these sort of Lego connectors for the screen, I'm assuming, so I'm gonna undo that, all right. And I think the only thing that's holding in the board are these tri-point screws right here, so I'm gonna get rid of those as well. So we'll take out the little button. The button's actually right there, very small button. Let's see if we can take the, okay, so the board does come out. All right, hey, look at that. Wow, so this right here is the FPGA, the power switch, and maybe there is IR, but there's also an ESP32, and I wonder if maybe they're gonna do some Wi-Fi stuff in the future. But yeah, button contacts, your 3.5mm headphone jack, USB-C for maybe, I guess, updating the firmware. Oh, and then actually, if we look here, so we got our membranes, but then kind of like in the SP, for the speaker contacts are these spring-loaded contacts that connect to the main board right here. And this is kind of very reminiscent of the Game Boy Advance SP. And then here we have custom screen, you got your membranes with your buttons below, and then the speaker module, which is pretty beefy with these spring-loaded contacts. Very cool. All right, so I'm gonna put this back together. Now, as far as the feel, this feels really nice in the hands. When you compare it to the original, it looks to be about the same thickness. They both got the little bump on the bottom. So they did really try to somewhat emulate the original Game Boy Color shell. Overall, I think they did a really good job. The fit and finish of everything looks great. As far as ergonomics, it's really nicely done. So some of the other things that I wanted to talk about on this console, what differentiates this from other products out there? The Mod Retro retails for, I think it's $199, so about $200. And as far as I could tell, it's really maybe the materials, because let's be honest, a lot of the other sort of retro handhelds, whether it be an emulation handheld from say Anbernic or a modded, original Game Boy Color, you can actually do those for far less expensive. Even the Analog Pocket, which is a far more capable device in terms of what game consoles it's compatible with, and it's only $20 more. So what makes this sort of justify that price? And from what I gather, it's premium materials and this custom screen, I think, is maybe where that high price tag comes from. Let's talk about the premium materials here. So we have a sapphire crystal lens. So the benefit of that is it has very high scratch resistance. So for example, with the Analog Pocket, I'm assuming it has a plastic lens, and typically what most people would do to protect that lens is you would put a screen protector on there. With the Mod Retro, you don't really need to, because the sapphire crystal is in of itself very scratch resistant. Now, the other sort of premium material that this uses is a magnesium shell. And magnesium is, I think it's known for being ultra lightweight. And I think it's supposed to be pretty durable as well. You know, it's not titanium, but magnesium has a strength to weight ratio that's pretty high. So very strong, very lightweight. You compare that to, say, the Analog Pocket. You got a polycarbonate, or I guess maybe, you know, plastic, ABS plastic shell. And then you have a plastic screen lens and maybe a protector applied to it. So really that's kind of one aspect of the high cost, are the premium materials in the magnesium and the sapphire crystal. But the other thing is the actual, you know, LCD itself. This was a completely custom LCD, like I mentioned. Again, it says something about being able to be, you know, played in direct sunlight, which, okay, you know, I don't really take these outside all too often. But hey, you know, that could be, you know, for somebody who brings this with them on the go, that might be a nice feature to have. You know, something that's not really prominently, as far as I could tell, featured here on the cover, you know, how is this thing powered? And basically this is running off of a FPGA, or field programmable gate array. If that sounds familiar, that's probably because that's what the Analog Pocket also runs off of. And the Analog Pocket is only $20 more than that. So for an extra $20, what you get is compatibility with a ton of other FPGA cores. Now, I don't know the exact one that's in here, but the one in the Analog Pocket is actually a fairly powerful one, and it can actually emulate a ton of different consoles. So if I go to their Open FPGA, I got Game & Watch, Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, Game Gear, Genesis. This can operate multiple retro video game console cores. Now, this is also FPGA based, but obviously not as flexible. This only does Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. Nothing wrong with that. Depends what you're into and what you want to get out of a handheld. If you're just a die-hard Game Boy or Game Boy Color fan, well, you have other options. For example, this is I think it's the FPGBC, so this is the funny playing version of the Game Boy Color. This is a Game Boy Color, but obviously you can play Game Boy games. The screen here is maybe, you know, depending on what you're into, not as accurate. This has a higher pixel density count than this one. For me, the color palettes aren't the most important thing. For me, it's how good do the colors look? Are they saturated? And to me, the screen on the funny playing FPGA-based Game Boy Color is perfectly fine. And this, I think, altogether for the funny playing is like 80 bucks. So that's like less than half of this. And then of course, there's always the option of original hardware. So this is I'm using an original Game Boy Color motherboard here. Now, the only thing that's really aftermarket on this are the buttons, the shell, and the screen, of course. And again, you know, this is gonna be compatible with everything. This is original hardware. This is the real deal. The FPGA in this is mimicking the actual CPU in this Game Boy Color. You know, this is obviously a much more saturated screen. The colors are much more punchier than they are here on the Mod Retro. But hey, maybe the Mod Retro is more accurate, because yeah, the original hardware, which I actually don't have an unmodified console, but the original screen on a Game Boy Color is pretty washed out. I'm not saying this looks washed out, but this definitely doesn't have as much saturation as the funny playing aftermarket screen. So I'm having a hard time trying to find the justification of getting the Mod Retro Chromatic over any of the other options out there. Overall, I have to say, I do like it. I think it's a very cool product. Although as far as when it comes to the price, I do think that's its major drawback. Would I buy it myself if I had, you know, the choice between a Analog Pocket or perhaps even a completely custom Game Boy Color that uses original hardware? I think I might opt for some of those other options before turning to the Mod Retro. But again, I don't want to knock this, because I do think there is a very specific customer who might enjoy something like this. This last segment of the video, I do want to dedicate to some of the questions that were posted from my Patreon supporters. The first question comes from Gigatronic, who asked, which consoles do you own so far? I might actually do a video on, you know, the consoles that I do have and show my collection. If you're interested, let me know in the comments if you want to see that, because I have basically at least one of every console released between the original Nintendo all the way to current generations. For the consoles I don't own, you know, there's the Xbox One, the Wii U, the Xbox Series X and S, and of course also, you know, I don't own a lot of these sort of offshoot variations. For retro, consoles. So that would be, at least I would consider 6th generation and back. So like PS2, Xbox, GameCube, Dreamcast and back. One of the ones that sticks out that I don't have is a Jaguar. I do want to get one eventually. And then I also don't have a Virtual Boy, which is a Nintendo console. But I also do not have the Sharp X1. So some of these more obscure Japanese PCs I don't have. The next question is from Kurt. Kurt writes, hey Tito, do you follow any esports? So I actually have, I don't do esports myself, and I actually have never been to an esports event. Which is actually interesting because, so I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and if I recall, the owner of the Washington Capitals and the Washington Wizards, Ted Leonsis, I think they actually started a esports team. Let me check here. Team Liquid is an esport team that Ted Leonsis owns here in the DC area. Again, I'm not familiar with what games they play, and I really haven't participated in esports myself, so I hope that answers the question. Tony writes, thank you for doing this, referring to this kind of dedicated section in the videos. I would love to learn how to solder. Do you have any recommendations for starter kits to learn the basics? And what I always recommend folks to do is, if you go to just Amazon, they have tons of these like sort of soldering kits to learn on. Typically you can build something cool like a clock or like a humidity sensor or sort of some sort of like sensor for your home. So you can actually make kind of useful things, but also learn how to solder. And they're really cheap. And I always recommend kind of searching for those test kits because you never want to practice on, you know, your actual Game Boy or your actual retro game hardware, because if you mess up, you could damage the console. I hope it answers your question. I probably might do a soldering basics video. There's a lot of other great videos on YouTube, but I might kind of do one maybe more retro video game console focused. The next one comes from home, and he says, hey Tito, what does your lab / workbench setup look like nowadays? Would love to see a video on all the equipment you're using. So that is definitely something I also want to make a video on. Actually, this might be the perfect channel to do that. I did make a video probably a little over a year ago. It's a little bit dated because I changed my soldering iron and a few other tools that I have. So yeah, I probably should do an update. Thank you for the comment and the question. And then the last one comes from Jeff, and Jeff writes, hi Tito, I'm curious if you have an Ultimate PS3 and what apps do you use with it? If you were willing to do a deep dive on the console, I'd love to know how you can get DLC to load and work. So great question. So I actually don't have an Ultimate PS3 console, but I do plan on doing a PS3 video in the future. Where the PS3, the Xbox 360, that's right on the cusp of retro. They're very modern consoles, and modding them is way different than a lot of the retro consoles. With most of the retro consoles that I modify, a lot of it's just hardware. You solder something in and it just does what the mod is supposed to do. When you start getting to the 360 and the PS3, it's a lot more software setup. So I do plan on doing a PS3 video, and some of it's gonna focus on actually maintenance, because as you know, you get the yellow light of death, with the RSX GPU, it just kind of burns itself out. Really, that's just a problem with the hardware, but I do plan on doing some PS3 refurb, repair, and maybe some modding videos in the future. So that's really the end of the video, guys. Let me know what you think about this format. Maybe what you'd like to see on this channel specifically. If you have any video ideas, I'm totally open to suggestions. Just drop them in the comment section below. I'll definitely be reading the comments and taking your feedback to heart. But also, if you want to participate in these questions, definitely check out the Patreon. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's definitely new and I'm still sort of fleshing things out. But yeah, hopefully I'll improve it over time, and I'll catch you next time. See ya.